Lovers, welcome back to my channel. We are finally there. We are finally at the shadow, and we are going to talk about villains and how to write them. Now, this is way too big a topic for one video, so it's going to be a series of videos, and I'm going to go by genre this time. So genre, we're going to break it down, and we're going to talk about which villains belong in which story, because the thing about a villain is they have to be very specific, not just to the genre, but they need to be specific to the hero, and that is why they are the shadow. The hero is the agent of light, and the villain is the agent of shadow. So keep that in mind whenever you are writing a story, whatever kind of story you're writing. And because it's one of my very favorite genres, we're going to start with horror. And we're going to start with a wonderful, wonderful TV series that you might have heard of, Stranger Things. So, Stranger Things Season 4, major spoilers here. If you haven't seen it, go watch those 9 episodes, come back and watch this video because I don't want to spoil anything. But Season 4 is far superior to Season 3, and I would argue superior to all the seasons. And the reason I would argue that is because at the end of the day, this shadow is perfect. This is the perfect shadow for our major protagonist, who is Elle. Now, you could argue that there are a lot of protagonists going on, but our agent of light has been Elle, because the climax always relies on Elle doing something and overcoming something and rising to the occasion. That is what has to happen for the success of the party. And through Season 4, they keep talking about having lost their superhero. And that is who Elle is. She is Superman. She's our hero. Elle is our hero. Argue with me in the comments if you disagree. So, if Elle is the hero, then the shadow needs to be the shadow of Elle. And the shadow of Elle, 11, our light, is 1, or Henry, or
1. Vecna. Henry. Vecna/Henry/1.
This is how we would break it down. Now, I'm going to put this downloadable into Patreon, so you can grab it there and you can run through it. This week's is going to be specific to horror. Next week's we will do action. And then we will look at Batman, because I have to look at Batman. I'm not going to do this to not talk about the Joker. I mean, come on, you know me. I'm going to talk about Batman. I'm going to. So, we're going to talk, and we're going to also do my least favorite genre, which is love stories, but we're going to have a little fun with it, because not all love stories suck. Most of them do, but not all of them. If you look at StoryGrid, and you know I love me StoryGrid. StoryGrid is awesome. Sean Coyne is a genius, and you should definitely be listening to that podcast if you aren't already. But just to give you a little shortcut, there are genres, and these aren't the genres you find in the bookstore. Although some of them overlap, like horror and love stories, but they also don't include something like fantasy. So the reason they don't include fantasy is because fantasy falls into a different form of the clover, and maybe we'll break down the clover someday. If you want to see me break down the clover, I will do that in a future video. Let me know in the comments. But at this stage, we're going to look at the genre clovers that tell the kinds of stories we want to tell. And these have obligatory scenes and conventions, and those obligatory scenes and conventions are specific to these genres. So horror is a subgenre of the thriller, but what makes it so good is just how creepy and scary and just how high the stakes are in horror. They're so high, and I love it, and that's what I love, because that's what gets me excited in a story, is when the stakes are really, really high on a personal level. I know a lot of people like epic, world-building, war stuff, Star Wars kind of stuff. Star Wars is cool. Like, Star Wars is cool. I'm not going to say Star Wars is not cool. Star Wars is cool. It's cool. And the Marvel Universe and all that's the end of the world. But the thing is, like I said in that previous video, the end of like I said in a previous video, and I quoted the closer look on this, that when you start talking about the end of the world, you have to take it with a grain of salt because you're pretty confident that the world didn't end. Because if it had, unless you're watching a very current piece, if it had ended, you wouldn't be reading the story or watching the movie. Am I right? I'm right. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. Anyway, but horror makes it personal. It makes it so personal. And that's one of the conventions of this. And what's great about Stranger Things is it gets so personal that a lot of these things are happening in people's heads, inside their heads. You don't get more personal than inside your own brain, do you? Do you? Do you? I don't think you do. What obligatory scenes do we need for the shadow in horror? Now, there are lots of obligatory scenes that we could talk about, but I don't want to get off track. So we're talking specifically about what makes a great antagonist and what the obligatory scenes, apart from what we see in the hero's journey, that we need in this story. Now, for the hero's journey, you're not obliged to have the shadow in any scene, really. The way we break down the hero's journey, you can watch that video that I've been talking about the fact that there are so many scenes in the hero's journey, and you don't need to have the shadow in any of them, or the shadow can be in all of them. It depends on what kind of story you're telling. And in a horror, sometimes it's better when the shadow doesn't appear. In sort of Lord of the Rings, which is not a horror, it's an action adventure, but the shadow, which is the Eye of Sauron, never really appears. The victory comes and we never actually meet the villain. And that makes it incredibly terrifying because as soon as you meet the villain, especially in a fantasy, it never meets the horror and the terror that you expect, because you can always imagine something worse. Stephen King says, you can always imagine something worse. So the shadow in a horror almost doesn't need to be in any scene. But there are some scenes that refer to the shadow in the obligatory scene list specifically for horror. Now it's what I want to talk about right now. So the obligatory scenes of a horror include a speech in praise of the monster. So we need at some point to have a speech in praise of the monster, saying how strong they are, say how amazing they are. We need a scene where preferably the hero tells us, the audience, and maybe another character, maybe their allies, exactly who this is. In Stranger Things, Will does this, and the Doctor does this, and I think Elle does this as well. We have a few speeches in praise of the villain in Stranger Things 4. There's a few scenes in praise of the villain there. So they totally hit the mark on that. Needs to become the final victim. And if that doesn't happen, you feel like the story hasn't been completed. We talked about this with the Allies video from last week, that if you're missing these characters, if you're missing these scenes, your audience isn't necessarily going to know why it feels empty and they're missing things. They're not going to necessarily understand what it is that was unsatisfying about the story, but they're definitely going to understand that something was unsatisfying about the story. So this is another one that you need. And in Stranger Things, we actually don't see that yet, do we? A little bit in this scene here that is behind me on the screen, where Elle faces one, and he's sort of, but then he switches from Elle. He says he's gonna kill her, but he switches from her to Megs. And when he does that, she's not the final victim. And so I suspect and hope that when we get the final installment of this series, we will actually see Elle become the final victim, because that is necessary for a really good horror story. And that is what needs to happen. And as I said that, so not only does the protagonist, the hero, the light, need to be the final victim of the shadow, not only that, but also they have to be at the mercy of the monster. And absolutely, Elle is here in this scene. She is definitely, well, momentarily, in a minute, she will be. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. She will be at the mercy of the monster, promise. And so that they've actually hit that nail on the head there, which make this scene. I actually didn't realize that there was going to be more until the last shot. I thought, oh wow, they're going to wrap this up quickly. But what they do at the end of this is they have the false ending. Everybody's reunited, everybody's back together, there's some healing happening in the town. We have a cathartic ending for Eddie. We have a hope for Max. We have the realization that Jonathan and Nancy might not be as solid as they are pretending to be. And we have that moment with Will. And, you know, they're cleaning up the house, and we have the moment with Will and Mike. And then, you know, obviously the reuniting of the family, the parents with the kids. And then it starts to snow. I thought snow could be so scary. So, those are your those are your 4 obligatory scenes. There's a 5th, but it has more to do with the hero, so I'm going to skip that one. If you want to know about obligatory scenes specifically for horror genre or any genre, let me know in the comments and I'll make some videos on obligatory scenes. But I don't want to get off track. Let's stay on track, Joe. Stay on track. Yeah? Alright, so you got your obligatory scenes that involve the shadow. So remember, in the hero's journey, the shadow does not have to be in any specific scene at all. The shadow doesn't have to be there. So, these are the scenes that need to involve the shadow in a horror genre. Again, speech in praise of the villain, in praise of the monster. The protagonist becomes the final victim of the monster. And the victim is victimized at the mercy of the monster. This is the core of a horror. Like, if the monster's not scary, then the whole story falls apart. And the false ending. Now, there are also conventions that we need to have in a horror genre. And these specifically referring to the shadow. Again, there are other ones, but I'm only going to talk about ones that are specific to the shadow. Because that's who we're talking about the shadow. So the monster can't be reasoned with. And we see this in this scene with Elle and One. We see them trying to, Elle trying to convince him that he doesn't have to do this. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. She keeps saying. But he can't be reasoned with. Like, no, I'm gonna do it my way. Another thing about the shadow of a horror genre is that there's a level of uncertainty. You never know when the shadow's going to attack. You can't predict them. They're unpredictable. And this makes it so your audience can never just rest easy. They can never just go, oh, I'm okay, I'm settled, I'm fine, you know, I'm settling in, this is cozy. No, you freak them out. And that's where jump scares come from. But jump scares is kind of a cheap way of doing it. What you want is like Stranger Things, where we don't get a lot of jump scares. We get a lot of, we know they're coming. We know they're coming, and then it's terrifying. And maybe a misdirect, because a good misdirect is good every now and then. So, also want to, in a shadow, in a horror genre, you want to mask the power of the monster. You want to have a progressive reveal, but they're levels of power, and they definitely do this in Stranger Things, because they think they've got him. They think they've got one. They think... But no, he's out there. He's still out there. And we haven't seen the full extent of his power yet. And that is very scary because he's already bested Elle. So we're scared. We're very scared. Like I said, you don't actually have to have the shadow in any of those obligatory scenes of the hero's journey. So you want to keep the monster off screen as long as possible. This is key in a horror because as soon as you reveal them, as soon as we know that one is the monster, we know that at some level he's human. And that takes a little bit of the bite out of it. A little bit. Just a little bit. And you want the stakes to be really high before you reveal that the monster might have a weakness. That's key. That's super key. Another convention of the horror genre is that the victims are experience horrific attacks via a distance. So they don't have to be close to the monster to be attacked. And this is what's great about Stranger Things, because they've established that Elle can travel in minds the same way that one can. We have this amazing, amazing moment where we realize that one can attack you anywhere. Because Elle can travel over space and time through the mind, and so can one. And one's maybe better at it. One doesn't seem to need, a pizza fridge to do it. Those are the conventions of it. Now, the key thing of the shadow, the key thing, and I'm going to repeat this in all these videos, and I'm going to show you how it is in Stranger Things, and I'm going to put it in that downloadable so you can see it as an example. But the shadow is the hero, and the hero could be the shadow, but one slight difference. So in the case of Stranger Things, Elle and one were both under the same torment and treatment from the doctor, from Papa. They both suffered the same way. And they both have extraordinary abilities and powers. Also, both gain their powers by being removed. Elle goes into those isolations so she can focus on her powers, and one has gained so much power by being in the upside down. And it is through this removal that they find their power. But this is where the light differs from the shadow. Elle seeks connection. She seeks love. She seeks to be connected with her friends and her family and her loved ones, with Mike and the other members of the D&D club, and Harper, and even Papa to a certain degree. She seeks these connections where one, he destroyed his family. He destroys his connections. He destroys them. And the reason he destroys them is to absorb their abilities and to gain more power. Whereas Elle uses the connections to drive the motivation behind the use of her power. Gives her power meaning through those connections. And we see that in this moment where Mike reaches out to her and connects with her. And we see it there. Way, Elle and one are the same. Both have amazing powers. But one looks at those powers different. It's a value shift. You see what I'm saying? So Elle's values are on the connections and the people she loves, and she uses her power to protect them. Whereas one uses his power to destroy everything so that he can gain more power. And now, obviously, horror is a pretty blanket statement. And obviously, this isn't everybody's idea of horror, and that is because there are subgenres of horror. So I couldn't let this video go without pausing a little bit and stopping and looking back and saying, look, there is an uncanny force. This is an uncanny, a force of evil. The uncanny. Frankenstein's monster is an explainable monster. So the force of evil is, in the uncanny, the force of evil is irrational. This is uncanny because it's rational to a certain degree, because he has a psychic superpower that we've established in the real world, the same way we established Frankenstein's monster as real. A supernatural horror is a force of evil as a spirit the world cannot be explained. A convention, it can't be explained away with conventional thought. A ghost story, for example, might be a supernatural horror. Then there's also the possession of spirits and the undead feeding off human, like vampires and zombies. And then there's the ambiguous, the evil, the evil shadow could be possessed by the devil or just plain crazy, like in Scream. And we never know. My favorite is the uncanny, and the reason for that is because it's a little scarier when the horror, when the nightmare is grounded in reality. This could happen, there by the grace of God and all that. That's really exciting. Elle could be the monster. And the idea that we could be the monster, because we are Elle, she's the hero, and remember the hero is the person that character that brings us into the story, that takes us in there. Remember, so L is the character that brings us into this world, and it has everything explained. And the fact that we could be L, therefore we could be 1, is terrifying. Is absolutely terrifying. And that is what makes a really great story. So keep writing. Let me know in the comments what you're writing and which genre you want me to break down, if you want me to break down genres, or if you want me to tell you all about genres and Cloverleafs, because genres are really, really cool, and they're another great tool in your toolbox, and we've just skimmed the surface. As I said, next couple of weeks, I'm going to be looking at the shadow from different perspectives, different points of view, different kinds of stories, different genres. So hit that like and subscribe and keep writing. What if I told you that you had all the tools you needed in your toolbox, like the greatest villain, and all you needed to do was access that? The next few weeks I'll be breaking down the villains that you love and explaining how you can use these tools in your story. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to leave me a comment what you would like to break down next.